I travel alone a lot and have been super fortunate to have minimal creepy encounters, but this one still makes my spine tingle. I was in London for 6 days on a stopover on my way back to Canada from 6 weeks in South Africa. I'd been working in South Africa, very long but rewarding days, so the London stop was touristy and lazy. It was just a nice reset before I got back home to Canada. There was a pub a block or two from the hostel I was staying in that I ate at every night. It was cheap, cozy, and never too crowded, so I'd bring a book, order a pint, and eat supper. I had chatted with the waitress a couple nights in a row. She was very kind, my age, and we exchanged a few stories. She knew from chatting that I was traveling alone and staying in a hostel nearby. Well, on day 4, I followed my usual route from the hostel to the pub and greeted the waitress. She said hello and quickly brought over a drink menu. Not 30 seconds after I had sat down, a man walked in and sat a few tables away. She motioned to him and mumbled, "Do you know him?" I kind of laughed and said, "Definitely not. I don't know anyone in London." She nodded and positioned herself between myself and the man and said quietly, "He got off a bench and followed you from the street over. I don't like the look of him and I thought I'd just ask. It might be nothing, but thought I'd mention it anyway." I thanked her and said I'm sure it's just a coincidence. She shrugged and took my order, and the evening proceeded as usual. The man also ordered a drink, but no food. I stayed for over 2 hours, reading, eating, and drinking. The pub was quiet, and a few other people or groups came and went, but the man stayed. He drank the 1 pint and refused top-ups. The waitress kept a close eye on him and me, and stopped over to chat several times between refills, but didn't bring him up again. When I was finishing my last drink and preparing to leave, I glanced over at him and noticed he looked on the edge of his seat, like he was preparing to leave too. I hadn't really thought much of it until then, but my stomach suddenly knotted up. It was dark and drizzly, and I had a short but lonesome walk back to my hostel. I suddenly felt distinctly unsafe. I summoned the waitress over to pay and asked her if she'd mind calling me a taxi as well. She nodded vigorously, and I knew she thought this was a good idea. The taxi showed up. I thanked the waitress and left. I hopped in the taxi, and I swear that old man thought I was so dumb for needing a drive for such a short distance, but whatever. I felt so much safer. I went back the next evening as it would be my last night in London, and I wanted to say goodbye. I wanted to thank the waitress for her hospitality, friendship, and ultimately looking out for me. When I arrived, she ran over and said she was so glad I'd called that cab. I guess right after I left, that man left too, seemingly really agitated. He'd not even asked for a bill, just left money on the table and stormed out. She felt very confident that he had seen me walking alone, followed me in, and was planning to, quote, approach me when I left. What would have happened then, neither her nor I really wanted to think about. I had a lovely last night at the pub, and we even shared some small glasses of wine together for a quick cheers before I left. I don't walk places alone at night anymore, even if it is just a short distance. I was driving from Georgia to California to visit a friend. I didn't want to fly because I wanted to sightsee on the way. The hotel I booked on Expedia screamed run from the get-go, but I was exhausted and wanted to rest. I got my room key and checked in. I locked the door, and because I'm always on guard, I locked the bar on the door for extra safety. About 4 a.m., I was sleeping and heard someone trying to come into my room. They had opened the door but couldn't get past the little bar that was locked. I quickly got up, threw my clothes on, and went to the door to see what was going on. 2 guys outside the door with their hand on the slit of the door yelling at me. They kept saying, "Come here, pretty girl. Oh, a pretty face," or something like that. I called the front desk to see what was going on, and they said, "Oh, I didn't know that you were still here." I was beyond furious and went to the front desk with all of my stuff. The lady at the desk said I didn't have a reservation even though I had my papers saying I was checked in. I had my car decal stickers for parking there, and the room key. She said that she rented the room out that I was in for the next month. Flabbergasted, I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She looked up my information and said, "Oh, I see, you didn't book with us, but through Expedia. We don't partner with them." Still confused as to why in the world I was given a room, paid for it, and had issues being in it. She refused to call her manager at 5 a.m. by that point, so I waited until they got in at 9 a.m., demanded a refund, got it, and checked out. No matter how terrifying the ordeal seemed, I think it would have ended differently had I not locked the bar on the door. Let's set the scene. It's on an island in the Philippines. Now, you're probably imagining old-growth forests and jungle, or things like that, but the wilderness on this island was mostly palm trees and swampland. Probably a tropical savanna if one was pressed for a classification. As you'll find on most Visayan islands, there was a beachy resort area with a few tourists lodging of varying quality. Catering to the tourists at said establishments were rental places renting out vehicles of even more varying quality. I, being young and therefore both poor and foolhardy, rented the cheapest Chinese-made dirt bike in the town. I used said bike lightly for a day around the beach, and in unwitting preparation for my great adventure the following day, a component in the rear broke and had to be replaced at the shop. Now you see, I'd seen some maps and there was a second town, I'll call it Town B, with a beach several hours distance away by provincial highway. The highway itself took a large detour around an area of forest, skirting the coast and keeping as far away from the area as it is possible without physically propelling yourself into the ocean. However, there was a map sneakily hidden in the darkest corner of the local restaurant that told a different story. The map was faded, as the mining or plantation venture it was produced for had long since folded. But behind this brown tinge in 60s topography was the unmistakable dotted line of a trail cutting from one curve of the highway to another and eliminating half the distance. So, the next morning I got up bright and early to drive to Town B, packing some beach gear and making emphatically sure not to pack something totally unnecessary, like a torch. I trundle along the highway for a little while, being passed at breakneck speed by trucks and jeeps belching black smoke until I hit my turnoff. The initial part of the secondary road was cement, which was a good sign, and I followed it through some villages. Rice paddies gave way to more and more palm trees, and the road itself became gravel. With every passing mile, the houses became scarcer, the palm trees became denser, and the road became wetter, more rutted, and more orange with clay. Roughly 90 minutes passed between the final house I saw on one side and the first one I saw on the other. The road itself was literally a walking track in width for a good 45 of those minutes. It was all mud and rock with deep drainage marks crisscrossing the surface and puddles everywhere. One pool was almost an engine killer in depth and length and required a lot of coaxing to get the bike not to suffocate. At this point I was absolutely filthy. My wrists and biceps were aching and my teeth were almost rattled out of my gums. But I had made good time and it was not even noon when I reached Town B. Going from A to B, there had been complete success, so as you can imagine, I strutted around the beach all afternoon with the smuggest expression humanly possible. Anyway, during the afternoon, I decided I could backtrack through the same route because I'd done it once, and if you can do something once, nothing bad can ever happen in any of the subsequent times because you know everything there is to know, right? By the time I reached the last house on the side of Town B, it was late afternoon. Logically, I sped up, because the secret to avoiding the dangers of reduced visibility is to outrun it. Now, the back of the bike was bouncing around like wild, but I was making good time. That was until the part that was fixed the previous day gave way again. Of course, that wasn't immediately clear at the time. What I did feel was the bike making a hard right into the foliage while I clung on with one hand. That was until the side of the bike went thunk into a tree and thunked me right off into the mire. I went flying one way, landing on my back, and the bike went bouncing another, landing quite miraculously on the road, or however you'd describe it. I don't know if you're meant to pass out after that kind of thing, because my body did the opposite, and I basically flung myself onto the bike to get back upright. Unfortunately, adrenaline can only do so much, and I soon felt this ridiculously intense throbbing rising from my right leg. My kneecap took the full force of the tree trunk, and basically all the skin was hanging off. Bone and muscle was not visible, but a lump of skin about the size of my palm was hanging down and the kneecap itself was visibly strange. I later learned it was fractured in several places. I then fell on my ass when I realized the enormity of being absolutely unable to walk the distance necessary to get help. Amazingly, the bike motor was still running, and although basically all the brake pedal and protrusions on the right side were bent up against the bike and every piece of bodywork was hanging off, the only fundamental problem with the bike was the broken rear axle. In a stroke of luck that feels like it could have only come from a divine power, the axle rod that had been taken out of the bike the previous day was still in with the toolset provided in the storage. I know it sounds contrived, but rather than fix the issue, the owner had replaced one axle rod with an even older one, taken $5 to do so and put the existing and pretty much fine one back into the toolkit. In the last light of the day, I took apart the rear of the bike and replaced the parts as best as I could with my limited knowledge of motorcycles. Basically, I reassembled it from memory. By now, dusk was becoming night. I still had what was 1 hour of driving during the day to complete, and my leg was stained red with blood and pretty much immovable. It took a good while and a good deal of struggling to even mount the bike. However, practically everything else was hand-operated, including the ignition, so it was drivable. Drivable in a sense, because the lights were broken and I was in the pitch-black rainforest covered in puddles and rocks and vines. In hindsight, it may have been smarter to wait the night, but I gunned the throttle and started moving as slow as was possible without stalling. Now, the night happened to be clear and the moon was gibbous, so there was a slight but noticeable amount of light shining on the road. The human eye is amazing when it comes to that, and with every passing minute moving at walking pace, the path became clearer. This means one vaguely lighter shade of gray compared to another, but it was enough to avoid rolling off the beaten track too often or making further thunks against trees. Throttle, idle. Throttle, idle. More throttle to clear a rock, idle. Really ridiculously slow for hours, until I hit the largest puddle that I had met the last time. This one was quite visible with the moon reflecting off of it. I wasn't really in any position to push the bike across, so I crossed my fingers and let the bike roll in and drove as straight as possible. All was fine until the last meters after the puddle where, to my horror, there was a patch of deep mud I'd avoided before. The rear wheel gets stuck deep. My leg is destroyed, so there's no way I can brace myself and manhandle the bike out. Having come so far, I go absolutely animalistic and force all of my weight forward on the handlebars while gunning the throttle as hard as it would go on to the lowest gear. The bike starts to smell like burning, but gradually the rear wheel wrenches itself forward and I slide this motherfucker out of the deep mud with all the fury of an old-time deity they'd sacrifice children to. And then I tipped over face first into some shallow mud. Anyway, it got easier from there, and at about 5 a.m. I dragged my sorry, muddy ass through the gates of a local clinic who patched me up, and then called an ambulance that took me to an even better clinic. The owner settled the damage for literally $50 because his dodgy bike repair was obviously to blame, and he didn't want to be chewed out or extorted by the police, particularly because the provincial government was doing everything short of sexual favors to generate tourism. We used to visit my dad's side of the family in Kentucky a lot around the 4th of July, as it was close to my uncle's birthday. This one particular year, both he and my dad decided they wanted to shoot off some fireworks in the backyard. Well, it wasn't really a yard, and more so a relatively large open space. I'd say about 1.5 acres. It didn't have any large grass fields, and was mostly concrete. It was mostly utilized for cars, as well as a small area for a basketball court. Anyway, they wanted to use this space for the fireworks. At the time, I don't think it was legal to buy large fireworks in the state of Kentucky, so my dad and uncle drove to Tennessee to grab some. They lived in Bowling Green, Kentucky, which was only about an hour from the border near Nashville. They ended up returning with a bunch of big boxes filled with all types of fireworks. I don't remember exactly what kinds, as I was still pretty young during this time, but I do remember them blowing up above us and how they looked and sounded like professional ones you'd see at the shows. That night, they started getting things set up while the rest of the family made dinner. I was just playing some basketball or something by myself, because I was the oldest kid and my only other cousin there was a baby at the time. Now look, neither my dad or uncle were professionals in any sense of the word when it came to working with pyrotechnics or explosives. They just got a big lighter, would make it spark, then run away, and I do believe my uncle was the one lighting them up. The time came for everyone to get situated. My gram, who lived next to my uncle, had a big balcony with a nice view behind her house looking down on where they were lighting their fireworks. So I sat up there with her while she held my baby cousin. I remember being super excited to see the explosions go off, but not at all for the close-up noises, so I had earplugs in, as did my gram and my little cousin. Everything was going super awesome for a while. I wasn't worried about fires or anything really because I just wanted to see the big booms and colors. After about 10 or so fireworks, my uncle brought out a semi-large cannon, one that would shoot out those bundled balls that exploded really high up. I was super excited to see these, because they were the double exploding ones, the ones that would pop off once, then go higher and pop off again in a different color. My uncle set off 2 of them, no hitch. However, when it came to the third one, he set it off like normal, and it exploded once like normal, but there was no second explosion. I remember feeling disappointed and my gram saying that it was probably just a dud. I also remember seeing my dad and uncle waving their arms from below, so I waved back, thinking they were just saying hi to all of us. All of a sudden, I hear a quick, high-pitched whirling noise as something came crashing down between my gram holding my cousin and I. We were no more than 3 feet apart from each other. It hit the balcony so hard that it smashed straight through the wood, leaving a relatively large hole as well as some smoke coming from it. It took me a couple seconds to register what had just happened, as well as my gram. She just screamed, "Oh shit!" and ran inside with my cousin. She then turned around and told me to get away from the hole. So I did as I was told and ran the other way down the balcony stairs where I met my uncle and dad. It turns out they had been waving and yelling at us to move away because of the potential of falling debris, knowing that the firework was a dud. My gram, cousin, and I just didn't hear or understand what they were doing, instead thinking they were just waving at us because of the earplugs. Luckily, the dud was actually a dud and didn't go off underneath the balcony because it would have surely caused a fire. We're even more lucky, though, that the dud zipped right between my gram and I as it pummeled into the ground, narrowly missing us both. Well, this is a fun one. I was once at the beach with my brother and cousins, just having a grand old time swimming and letting the waves crash against our bodies. I've never really been physically gifted, but I'm a good swimmer, so when we all decided to start swimming farther away from the shore, I was pretty confident of being able to make it back. And so we went on, the shoreline becoming a mere line of sand in our eyes, and the rest of our kin the size of ants. Before we realized it, the sun was beginning to set, and in what seemed like only a few minutes, the waves, which were already very tall to begin with, easily tripled the size of 15-year-old me. When that happened, and our mothers became aware, they all hurried us to go back to the shore, and funnily enough, nobody hesitated. The task was easy for my brother and cousins, all of whom are taller and older than me, so I tried to follow them. I swam and I swam and I swam. No matter how much I seemed to swim, I was no closer to the shoreline than I was before. In fact, it wasn't long before I realized I was actually getting further away. The waves had begun pulling my body backwards into the ocean without me being fully aware of it. I could even hear the lifeguard's whistle telling the others to get out of the water. That's when I felt the peculiar heartbeat in my chest, the one that you feel when you're about to ask that girl out that you like, or the kind that you feel when you're about to reveal to your parents the bad grades you got at school. The kind of heartbeat that indicates fear. As soon as I felt it, I realized I was in big, big trouble. I felt like I was going to become another one of those drowned kids at the beach tales mothers told their sons as a way to keep them close to shore. My brother was completely out of sight along with my cousins, and I was still there, trapped by waves that consistently grabbed my feet and pulled it deeper into the ocean. At this point I was panicking, and I wasn't sure when or even if my family would go to the lifeguard for help. Against uncertainty, I decided that I had no choice but to keep trying to swim back to shore, and that I did. It was hard, very hard, and if you ask me how I did it today, I'd tell you I'm one clever motherfucker. Or maybe the problem wasn't as bad as I believed it to be. Once I was able to calm down again, I knew that all those tales of drowned people always went bad when they started panicking. So I took a deep breath and began doing this little, quote, technique. Whenever the waves pulled, I'd swim slowly, trying to maintain the ground I was in, and when the waves pushed, I gave it my all. I swam as fast as I could, thinking and knowing that the momentum of the waves, plus my efforts, would help me reach the shore again. To this day, I had no idea if I was right or wrong. Soon, I could feel the motes of sand running across my toes once again. Only a few more seconds passed before my chest laid a thin sheet of sand, and a few more passed before I could walk on it. It felt like pure bliss and badassery. I felt like an aquatic Bear Grylls for being able to come up with such a solution, and was eager to tell my mom and cousins about it. Soon, of course, reality hit me again. I was received with a slap by my mother, who continued to rant on about how she had told me not to go so far away, how they were about to call the lifeguards, and how dumb I had been to disobey. My kin laughed at me as my mother yelled, and I soon learned that I only spent 5 to 10 minutes at sea anyway. This one's a long one, but it's worth the read if you like wild, reckless stupidity. A while back I was homeless and couch hopping, and all I ever did was party and get incredibly fucked up as often as possible. I went to raves pretty often, and was invited out to a moon gathering in the mountains in Northern Virginia. A moon gathering is basically just a get-together of ravers and other trippy types to celebrate the full moon and trip balls and smoke DMT. I decided to invite my friend D from Virginia Beach, which was 4 hours away. He's a big raver and jumped at the invite. Around 10 p.m., he showed up with his female friend S and all of his rave toys, full gear and everything. Now, this wasn't really the rave he was expecting, and he got really disappointed that there was no MDMA there. He then asked if I wanted to come with him to go get some. I was tripping on a few hits of acid at this point, so in the confusion, I assumed he meant somewhere close. He did not. 2 hours later, I'm in the car and we pass Richmond. I ask him where the hell we're going, and he says, "Back to Virginia Beach." I freaked out and tell him to turn the car around because I'm not about to get stuck 5 hours from home. He refuses and promises to take me home the next day. Tripping and drunk, I agree, and we went to S's place to drink boxed wine and watch movies until morning. Well, morning comes and D is asleep. He refuses to wake up until about 4 p.m., at which point we finally go and get 3.5 grams of MDMA. After capping into 0.1 doses, we decided a good course of action would be to sell it back in my hometown in Maryland, because there we could get a higher price for it, and will cover gas money for the trip. After capping it up, we each take like 0.15 and get in the car so D can drive us back to Maryland to sell it. About a half hour into the drive, we both start rolling tits. D decides he's a gangster, so he pulls out his gun from under the seat and puts it on his dashboard. Then he decides his pockets are too full, so he pulls out all of the molly and all of his cash and lays it out on the dashboard next to the gun. At this point, I realize he's a psychopath, and as we weave in and out of busy rush hour interstate traffic, he decides now would be a great time to pull out his laptop and start mixing dubstep on virtual DJ. By now, I've accepted that I'll probably die on the way to Maryland, so I start enjoying the ride as the rolls kick harder and harder. I'm rolling absolute balls by now, and we basically just party the whole way, bumping music and avoiding cops, smoking blunts and drinking Four Locos. It was actually kind of a good time, despite the constant fear of death. So, we make it back to Maryland, somehow all in one piece, and we decide that a good base of operation will be my friend, who is a heroin addict with an incredibly dysfunctional family, and we take our stuff to T's house. We set up shop and people come up and buy the entire set of 35 pills within 24 hours. Now we've got like $600, and besides gas money and other expenses, D still has $250 to spend. He decided that he wanted something that was hard to come by in Virginia Beach, so I suggested PCP, which is pretty common in the DC area. He likes the idea, so I arrange a half ounce of liquid PCP for $200. We go and pick it up in DC, and he decides to hang around for another day to give it a try since he's never tried it before. We smoke a few dipped Newports and get fucking gooped out, spending the whole night in a confused haze before he decides to head out with the PCP at like 8 a.m. without getting any sleep. Next thing I know, I'm getting on a phone call with his girlfriend, who is a great friend of mine from childhood, asking me what the fuck I gave her boyfriend and how the fuck he started acting so insane. Apparently, D had gotten home acting completely bizarre. He was smoking the PCP pretty much the whole way home and went berserk, wildly looking for his gun, and acting as if he thought he was being followed. I don't know the whole story, but he basically had a minor breakdown and got violent with a few people, so they had to put him in a psych ward for a few weeks. Since then, I've heard he's doing well. He and his girl have a kid now, and he's cleaned up his act, which is good to hear. TLDR, don't do drugs. So I had a good friend whose parents owned a tourist fishing camp in northern Ontario, which could only be reached by a 45-minute flight or a 1.5-hour train ride. One winter I head out there with him and another friend to do a job for another camp on the lake. The job involves shoveling snow into a half-buried shed that is filled with Rubbermaid storage bins containing ice. The snow and ice last for most of the summer, and it's how they refrigerate. The job goes good, we make some money, drink, snowmobile around, sleep in a winterized cabin, and generally have a good time. The following year I get a call from the camp down the lake. My friend is unavailable, so they want to know if I'll do the job myself. Sure, why not? What could go wrong? So I pack up all of my gear, take a train ride 1.5 hours into northern Ontario wilderness in the middle of winter, and head to the camp. I get off at the train into a nice snowfall and a temp of negative 25 degrees Celsius. Running off my memory, I started out on the lake towards the camp. Not even 5 minutes out onto the lake, the ice starts to break. I manage to get a couple of steps once this happens, throw my gear while jumping forward and sprawling out spread eagle, so my body is half in the water, half out. Somehow I manage to wriggle clear of the water and collect my gear. I'm soaked in this negative 25 degrees, and my only option is to get to the cabin and get dry and warm, or I'll die. So I hike about 2 kilometers around a peninsula and expect to see the cabin in the bay, which it wasn't. I had gone the wrong direction, so I now needed to backtrack and head the other way, adding even extra time. I finally reached my destination, half froze and definitely feeling the effects of hypothermia. I had been shaking uncontrollably for the better part of 2 hours. Now, there was supposed to be a cabin left unlocked and stocked with wood and a pile out back. However, there was no cabin left unlocked, and definitely no wood inside or otherwise. So I made a fire of the little bit of wood in the wood box and proceeded to burn everything I possibly could. This included chairs, the kitchen table, the wood box itself, amongst a bunch of other stuff. It wasn't much, but it did the trick. I was warm and my clothes were drying, and I even managed to heat up some soup. After warming up enough, I threw my stuff back on and went and broke into the other cabins looking for wood. There wasn't much, but I thought it'd be the last time for the night, so I threw it on the fire and I went to sleep. I'm not sure what time I woke up at. My watch was frozen solid, but I was shivering uncontrollably again and looking in a mirror by candlelight so I could see that my lips were purple and my face was white as a ghost. I knew that I had to get warm, that if I went back to sleep, I wouldn't be waking up in the morning. So I got dressed, I put on my boots, and I was pretty much still in all of my gear, and went out looking to get wood. Luckily, it was a full moon and I was able to see fairly well. I started by shoveling up every heap of snow that I could see, looking for the alleged wood pile. The only thing I found, however, was a stump. Knowing the stump wouldn't be enough, I grabbed an axe and started to cut down green trees. I managed to get a fair bit, and with the help of a few more broken chairs from other cabins and some kerosene, I got a fire going again. The smoke from the green pine branches filled the cabin, making my eyes water, but I didn't care. I was warm. The following day, the first thing I did was cut down some more trees. I made sure that I had enough to keep the fire going all day and night. Other than that, the rest of the time went by alright. I got the job done, had a good night's sleep, and caught the train the next morning. Needless to say, when they asked again the following year, I declined the job. I was backpacking my way through Asia in the early 2000s and spent quite a bit of time in Hong Kong. Hong Kong Island is pretty hilly to say the least. I found myself near a fancy hotel, I can't remember which hotel exactly, that was on a higher plane than where I wanted to go and didn't see an easy way to get down. I spotted an entrance to a set of stairs that I thought could exit to the street below. These weren't outdoor stairs, they led underground in retrospect. Probably the fire exit for the hotel. The door was unlocked and I just went in. Each floor had a door that I assumed led into the hotel or would exit to the street. I found each one was locked. I probably should have just left as soon as I saw the first one was locked, but I was young and dumb and thought that eventually there would be a door that led out to the street below. So I kept going down this extremely dark stairwell, trying to open each door. When I finally reached the bottom, I noticed a bunch of shapes in the darkness, mostly rags and boxes. Then I noticed the movement. There were maybe 5 or 6 men down there all sprawled out, not talking or anything, but they noticed me and at least one was staring at me, the whites of his eyes reflecting what little bit of light was down there. They were definitely high. I can only assume I had barged my way into some sort of heroin den. I just sort of stood there looking at them, and they were looking at me, no one saying anything. I slowly backed up out of their sight and then rushed all the way back up, maybe 5 floors or so. Maybe it's not too creepy compared to other stories, but I was definitely freaked out for a while. It was totally dark and no one knew I was down there. Of course, maybe they were equally freaked out that someone had barged into their secret spot. I was 18 and it was my first time traveling alone. I went to Argentina for 3 months, my first weekend, and I'm wandering around Buenos Aires. At the time, I knew enough Spanish to get by, and a man approaches me and asks me for directions in Spanish. I tell him that I'm not from here. He then asks if I'm a tourist. I say yes, and he seems delighted, quickly telling me that he is too. He offers up the idea to explore the city together. I, alone in the big city, agree. We start walking together, and he seems like a really nice guy. After about an hour, he says, "Tengo hambre," which means I'm hungry. I hadn't eaten since breakfast, and it's about 1, so we go out to a nice restaurant. He tells me I have to try the steaks and red wine. I'm not much of a wine fan, but he convinces me. We're there for about an hour, and the bill comes. It's 140 pesos. He pulls out 100 pesos. I try to pay for my half, but he only lets me pay 40 pesos. He tells me I can get the beers later. We continue on our little adventure and eventually come to a bar with outdoor seating. The waitress brings out a liter of beer, and we relax. Soon enough, another liter of beer comes out. We finish the second liter and leave the bar. And all of a sudden I wake up 8 hours later, missing my debit card, iPod, cell phone, and travel guide. Getting stuck on open ice during a blizzard. School got canceled for us, and the radio said that there was 130 to 150 kilometer winds due with heavy snow, but the sky was clear, so we just thought the school board was overreacting when they canceled that day. Me and a few friends decided we were going to go down to the beach and fuck around on the ice for a bit. We were going to play some hockey or take a walk out to the shipping channel, that sort of shit. So we were halfway out the shipping channel, like 15 minutes of walking, when one of my friends points down the bay at what could only be described as a rolling wall of snow. But it was far away, so we turned back and just started walking at our normal speed. Well, that wall was moving a hell of a lot faster than we thought because it hit us within 5 minutes and the wind almost knocked us off our feet. At that point, the ice starts creaking, so we all get on our bellies. We literally couldn't see more than a meter in front of us, but luckily we were already pointed towards land, so we just belly crawled until the creaking stopped, and kept walking forwards until we came across a set of snowmobile tracks which we followed in. It took us half an hour to get back to shore. A few years back, I had a friend who lived right alongside an Air Force base. We used to go out to his place to take acid as he had a really big, really awesome property to explore while high. One weekend, some friends got a few sheets of acid to sell. We were all out at our friend's property tripping. One of my friends, we'll call him Dave, got the idea that it would be a good idea to eat an entire sheet of acid. Unbeknownst to us, he took a whole sheet and chewed it up. Then he passed it to someone else and said, "Chew it a few times and pass it on." Everyone being completely gone went along with it. The next night, we're all still high and talking about how thoughts create reality and that kind of fry logic. Well, it comes up that if you believe hard enough in something, it will come true. So Dave says, "So if I believe in the Batcave, I'll find the Batcave?" We told him of course and continued our discussion. Some time passes and we don't realize Dave is gone now. His shoes and coat are gone and we see footprints heading out the back door into the snow. About that time, the phone rings. It's the Air Force. They want to know if we know a Dave. So the soberest of us got into the car and went to pick him up. When we got to the main gate of the base, Dave jumps out of a big black SUV with tinted windows. He gets in our car and says we should get out of here. He found the Batcave and Batman wasn't happy about it. It turns out Dave had walked through our friend's yard until he found a big razor-wired fence. He tossed his coat over the razor wire and climbed the fence. He kept walking until he found a big mound in the snow. When he got to it, there was a door and a keypad. Thinking that he had found the Batcave he created with his mind, he entered the last 4 of his social security number, which he had used to clock in at work. The keypad beeped and he opened the door. He walked down a long, steep flight of steps and found another door with a keypad. Again, he entered the last 4 of his social security number, and again the keypad beeped and the door opened. He walked down a long hallway until he hit another door and another keypad. At that point, 6 soldiers burst in with assault rifles pointed at his direction. After being interrogated for a few hours, they realized he was just a high guy exploring his friend's property and got lost. When they finally realized what happened, they called us to come pick him up. They decided against pressing charges, but warned him if something like this ever happened again, there would be a serious jail time offense. Apparently, they were a little embarrassed that some high guy managed to access a high security silo. I went to a big city in Colombia, and the hostel had a rooftop hangout spot. I'm a man from the USA. People left one by one until it was just me and a girl from Europe. It was around 10:30 p.m. when I last remember checking. She was quite friendly, and the conversation was very surface-level casual, asking about the best restaurants in town or something like that. Now, I was not drunk or doing drugs. I only had 2 light beers, they were less than 3%, in about 2.5 hours. But the next thing I remember from the night was waking up in the early morning hours in a hotel hallway bathroom shower with a jacket on now. The lights were completely out, and I struggled to gather my senses as I crawled around utterly confused in pitch blackness until I felt a toilet and realized I was in a bathroom. It was my jacket, by the way, but it was previously in a suitcase in my room. I then went back to my room, shared with 3 other people by creaky wood bunk beds, to sleep more after that. The next day, when I asked, nobody noticed anything strange about my night. They all slept soundly the whole night, which is also strange given I apparently came in inebriated to some degree. Got a jacket out of a suitcase on the top bunk, left, then came back. I honestly didn't bring it up to the girl ever, because I truly don't believe she was the cause of anything. We both saw each other plenty after that around the hostel for another week. She was genuinely a kind person. I didn't feel physically hurt whatsoever, and nothing of mine was stolen. I had a smartphone and about $150 cash in my pocket. I've never gotten an explanation for the night though, and I've never been aware of any sleepwalking habit. I, 22 male, always celebrate the 4th of July. I usually celebrate with my family, but this year I couldn't because I moved to a different city and I didn't feel like traveling. I was going to celebrate with my girlfriend and some of her friends, but her friends canceled last minute, so it ended up just being me and her. I packed some towels and snacks because we were going to watch the fireworks on the beach. When we arrived, I discovered that there were hardly any people. My girlfriend and I got out of the car and started walking to the beach. We sat down on the soft sand and waited, and we both had swimsuits on under our clothes because we were planning to go swimming after the fireworks show. Eventually, the fireworks show started, and we both watched. It lasted about 30 minutes, and then it was over. When it ended, we both stood up and took off our clothes. We got into the water and started talking, and we swam around a little bit and decided to get out. When we got out, the time was 12:34 a.m. We wrapped ourselves in the towels and began walking back to the car. As we were walking, I saw a figure behind my car. It was too dark to see what it looked like, but I could still make out a shape. As we got closer, I noticed that the person had on a hood, so I couldn't see their face. I turned to my girlfriend and pointed out the person. She looked at me and nodded. I could see that she noticed them too, and she was frightened. I looked at my girlfriend and told her, at the count of 3, run back to the car. She agreed and I started counting. 3, 2, 1, go! She ran and got into the car. I then began running too. Right when I made it to the car door, the person jumped out and tried to grab me. I dodged them and opened the car door. I jumped inside and locked all the doors. Right when I locked the doors, the person started pounding on the windows. I just drove off and never looked back. Quite a few years ago, there was a tropical storm coming up the coast. It didn't make landfall, but it was close enough to where we got the rain, wind, and huge waves that come with it. Onshore winds were probably 25 to 35 miles per hour, and waves hit 8 to 10 feet. It was so insanely choppy. Never in my life have I seen the waves that big and close together. My brothers and I went to go surf, but it was too choppy, so we grabbed our bodyboards and fins and paddled out. 5 minutes in, my one brother got out since he doesn't live on the coast and isn't the strongest swimmer. He also didn't have fins, so he watched from the beach. My other brother is on beach patrol, but was off, so the on-duty lifeguards pulled everyone out because of the rip currents and waves, but let us go in. We took a few waves, having a great time, but started to get worn out from consistently diving and fighting the waves trying to get back out. I dove under a wave, and as soon as I came up, I saw the biggest wave of my life cresting. I knew it was about to come down hard on my head, so like an idiot, I ditched my board and swam to the bottom. Not the best idea to ditch something that floats, but I had fins and probably wouldn't have been able to hold on anyway. The wave slammed me into the sand. I rolled head over heels for what felt like an eternity. Just as I got my bearings and started coming up to the surface, I heard another wave pound right above me and the same thing happened again. I tried coming up again, but a third wave hit. Finally, I could tell I was getting close to the beach because I was being dragged across the sand. I was able to hold on to the sand while the water went out and was able to finally breathe and stand up. I called it a day after that. My back was bleeding from being dragged across the sand and my legs felt like jelly. It probably wasn't more than 30 seconds, but shit, being underwater and not being able to come up for even that short of time is scary as fuck. But damn, it was fun before that. This is my quote-unquote best drug story because it finally made me realize I couldn't do drugs anymore. It was March of 2011 in Queens, New York. After being clean for about a year, I found myself strung out on heroin again, but managing to hold a job. It was payday and I got a $1,400 check, which I took directly to the bank and cashed. I decided to skip out on work early because I was starting to get dope sick. I went to a quote friend's house that I met at rehab who lived about 2 blocks away from my job. I call a cab and it brings my friend and I to the dealer's apartment in Bushwick, Brooklyn. The dealer knows we want 4 bundles of heroin and 10 dimes of crack. We went to the place and I hand quote Chino $430 and he gives me a plastic bag containing the drugs, which I tuck into my boxers. We get back to my friend's house and I prepare my shot. The bags of heroin were stamped One Love, which we had received a week prior and it was pretty weak. I think I shot about 20 bags in a day when we last got it. I decided to do a 3-bag shot as my initial dose, seeing how weak it was the last time we copped. I mixed 3 bags in a spoon, dropped a cotton in, and pulled the dope into my syringe. I tied off and found a vein on the first try. Most of my veins are pretty fucked up, so I felt lucky to hit so quick. As soon as I pushed down the plunger, I felt the most intense rush I've ever felt doing drugs, and I'm a tired and tested heroin junkie. I immediately said, "Holy fuck," as I pulled the needle from my arm and blacked out. Fast forward 40 minutes later and I wake up on the kitchen floor staring up at 2 uniformed cops and 3 EMTs. I had my first overdose. The friend called them and flushed all the drugs when I collapsed. I was completely blue when they got to the house and they gave me Narcan, which snapped me out of it. I was taken to the hospital and observed for 5 hours and then I was released. I got into a cab and copped 2 more bundles of heroin in Harlem and slept on a park bench, occasionally walking to a nearby McDonald's to shoot up. I made it to work on time at 8 a.m. that morning. After this, I decided to kick dope and drugs altogether, and yesterday was 5 months clean. At the airport when I landed, a cab came up and offered me a reasonable fare. I was loading my stuff in the car when an airport worker came over to me and warned me not to get in that cab because he will not take me to my hotel. I was like, "What?" She helped me get my stuff and told him she was watching him and he isn't getting another one. I asked her to explain. She was like, "He kidnaps tourists," and that was it. She smiled and told me to call Lyft. A few days later, I ran into another dude at a farmer's market. This dude would not leave me alone. He followed me from booth to booth. He followed me to the beach, back to my hotel. He kept trying to talk to me and flirt. I was like, "I'm fine, I just want to get some stuff. See you around." I was talking to a hotel worker because I made friends, and she asked me if I frequently traveled alone. I told her yeah, mostly because of the last-minute deals. At the time, I was a student, so I had a lot more time plus discount programs. He was hovering listening to this. I went back to the farmer's market while she went back to work because another guest had come up. I was trying to stay in a very public area, starting to get nervous. This taffy vendor saw me and saw what was happening and called me over. He told me about all of the flavors he had. Creepy stalker dude came over and asked me if I wanted to go for a walk. He says, "It's nice. My hotel has a very nice view and you should come check it out. I have some friends who would like to meet you." I said no, please leave me alone. And Taffy Man, my hero, was like, "You're ruining my sale, go away." The guy eventually backed off, but was still lingering out of earshot. Taffy Guy had called me over solely to get that guy to go away, and didn't expect me to buy any taffy. He said he wanted to make sure that I was safe, and if I wanted to try some I could, but he would let me know when the coast was clear. So I hung with the Taffy Guy for like an hour, and he told me it was safe. I bought like 8 bags and thanked him. When going to drop off the taffy at my room, lo and behold, my stalker had found me. I ran for it, locked the door, and waited for another hour or maybe 2 hours before I left my room and went to a restaurant and stayed there. I called my hotel for help, and they had someone escort me around. Going home, I again called Lyft. While I'm waiting outside my hotel for my Lyft, guess who is there? Stalker Man with the creepy cab guy. I run inside, find a hotel worker, tell her what's what. She calls my Lyft and tells them to a different spot so I can get out of there without being killed. Luckily I lived. I'm here to tell this story now. Shout out to her and the very, very cute taffy guy. I was in Newport, Rhode Island one summer, and I decided to go surfing at the beach during red tide season. Because I'm from California, I figured that I could handle, quote, just the little kelp, because in Malibu there's a ton of kelp, and it never really interfered with my surfing before. When I got to the beach in Newport, I suited up in my wetsuit and started to paddle on my board toward an area away from the red and smelly kelp. About 10 minutes in, I started catching a wave and I noticed a stinging sensation on my foot. When I brought my foot up onto the board, there wasn't a single scratch, so I continued surfing. Then, all of a sudden, I started to feel stinging sensations everywhere. I raced out of the ocean with my board and ripped my wetsuit off to find 20 plus sea lice biting me underneath. I picked every disgusting bug off of myself and then went to go sit in my car. Even then, I still had sea lice in my hair, biting my scalp. I didn't go back in the ocean for the rest of the week, and I'll never go into the ocean again during red tide season. Several years back, my family and my neighbor's family are hiking in northern New Mexico up Mount Touch-Me-Not, which is connected by a ridge to Mount Baldy, the famous mountain all the Boy Scouts hike at Philmont. On this hike is me, a 15-year-old male, my dad, my brother who's 13, my neighbor who's a 14-year-old male, his parents, and his two sisters, both 12 and 10. My dad and I have hiked this same trail half a dozen times in years past, and seeing as it wasn't too hard, we took everyone up. To get to the start, you drive up 2/3 of the mountain, then hike from there. We reach the peak early in the day, probably around 12 or 1. After a nice picnic and some pictures, we're ready to follow the trail down, and my dad leads. The first part is down a rocky slope, which we all handle just fine. Then the trail leads into the cover of trees. Keep in mind, it's less of a trail and more of a connect-the-dots style hike where you follow cairns all the way, which are little piles of rocks that let you know you're going the right way. Anyway, once we hit the trees, I take the lead for a half hour or so with my neighbor. I have to stop and tie my shoes, so my little brother then takes the lead, and my neighbor and I end up at the back of our group, which is fine. After about 30 minutes of hiking, I look around and notice something funny and ask my dad, "Hey, when was the last cairn?" He didn't know. We'd all been talking to each other, content letting my brother lead. We asked him when he saw the last cairn. His response? "What's a cairn?" Fuck. Now in hindsight, hiking back up and finding the trail would have been the smart move. It would have only cost us an hour or so. But my dad was sure that he knew where we were, and that he could get us back by going right, thinking that we had wandered left. I had thought the opposite, as did my neighbor, but our dads were in charge, so right we went. So we were hiking, and hiking, and hiking. No trail. It's now getting late, and after lots of debate, we convince our dads to hang up their egos and call search and rescue, which they do. They end up sending a fleet because we're in the mountains without any gear. They're all out blowing whistles and horns and asking us if we hear anything, but we don't. We weren't totally lost. We could still see the city we came from in the distance, sort of. So we keep moving. Search and rescue never find us, but we make it to the city around 9 p.m. What was supposed to be a 3-hour round trip turned into an 11-hour ordeal. The 10-year-old girl with us was a trooper. The kicker? Before we left, my brother got into an argument with my dad about wearing hiking socks. He didn't want to because he thought they'd look silly, so he wore ankle socks instead. He had blisters covering his entire heel when we got back. I mean like 3 inches or so in diameter. Solo female traveler here who's done my fair share of world travel. I was in Athens a couple years ago and went to go read in a park. I'd been traveling for about 3 months at the time and had just gotten off a massive trek in a different country and came to Greece to relax and enjoy. I had been a few times before, so no need to go to all the historical sites in a rush. A day in the park in the sun sounded perfect. Anyway, I was getting settled into a bench and got my book out to read. About a half hour later, I get that feeling that someone is watching me. I look up and see an older guy, maybe about 55 to 65, standing about 20 yards away just staring at me. He was like half in the foliage, too. There was also a little hill, so I couldn't see his full figure, just his face and upper chest through all the trees. He looked pretty harmless, but I did think it was weird, so I got up and cut through the park to head back to my hostel. He ended up following me. I assumed he didn't mean to follow me, per se, that this was just an awkward but innocent thing, kinda like when you say goodbye to someone too soon and then you still walk in the same direction with them a few feet more. I rationalized and assumed that he too had to leave the park at the exact same time as myself in the same direction. I was wrong. I take a turn to lose him that I now note was a bad idea. This took me to a more secluded part of the park. He ends up following me again. Now I notice he's really staring at me. I pick up my pace, but I don't start running because generally I've learned showing fear just makes things so much worse. I also break off a stick from a tree just in case he gets closer so I can have a very lame weapon. At this point he's still about 10 yards away and always kind of hidden behind a bush. And then that's when I notice that the guy's got his hand down his pants. This guy followed me around the park for probably 10 minutes, jacking off before I finally found a crowded area and sat down next to a bunch of women and later joined a tour group. It's not super terrifying, but just the weird image of him staring at me and perving on me kinda gives me the creeps to this day. I was working in TV news a few years ago, and I had to work on the 4th of July. I was in production and had to listen to police scanners for anything we could cover. The weather had been really nice and news was slow, so by 9:30, the only people left in the newsroom were an emergency on-call photographer, 2 anchors, and me. We had the show almost done when the weather got nasty, severe thunderstorms first, and then a tornado warning. The scanner had been busy all night due to fireworks calls. The tornado warning sent it into overdrive with various spotters calling in tornado sightings. We were all scrambling to fit the weather into the show right up to about 5 minutes before 10. The anchors were finally heading to the set when a muffled call came across the scanner that said, "A guy blew his head off with a firework." The dispatcher repeated the call back again, but this time said it was his hand, not his head. We'd already sent the photographer to one of the tornado damage spots and had no one to go check it out. A hand injury on the 4th is nothing, so we just let it go. The next morning I got to work and heard a guy had somehow procured a few shells from a commercial fireworks show or the government, depending on who you asked. He had rigged up one of them with a fuse and fired it off successfully early in the night. His neighbors in the trailer park said the second one wasn't so successful though. The homemade fuse didn't ignite the shell. The guy leaned over to try to light it again and kaboom, headless. The crew that went to cover it the next day had to step over pieces of the guy in the street to get video. They talked to his wife and asked her to send in a picture to use in the story. And of course, she sends in a headshot. I was on a camping trip with some of my stoner buddies in the middle of the woods. It was at least 15 miles from the nearest road and probably another 3 or 4 miles to the nearest occupied campsite besides ours. So we'd been smoking a lot of weed, primarily joints, at the end of every day. My friend Kay had bought something special for one night, and tonight was that night. This campsite we were all at was on an island. It was the only campsite. There was an amazing view of the lake from where we had put up our tent. What Kay had for us was shrooms. So 5 guys, including myself, probably took 3.5 grams of shrooms just over an hour before sunset. For 3 of us, it was our first time. An interesting thing to note would be the night prior at this campsite, we had been rudely awakened by an insane storm that nearly destroyed our tent and knocked over several trees at our campsite, disturbingly close to our tent. So we were a little startled by that, and this trip was no longer just fun and games. Things went seemingly well for the first hour or 2 after taking the shrooms. We watched the sunset and eventually decided to smoke some joints after. The 5 of us burned through 3 joints, all filled with some keef. I get pretty fucking out of it at this point. I start getting mildly anxious and we all head back to the campfire. Somewhere along the way, I have what must have been an hallucination happening to me. The memory is very vivid. I see a man in the woods, walking towards me, and then away from our campsite. So naturally I get up, shout, and point towards where I saw the man. In hindsight, this was a poor decision, as it freaked the fuck out of everyone there, but I genuinely saw a man. Next thing you know, us 5 are sitting back to back, wielding our various knives and shining our flashlights into the woods. I would say we stayed out there until the middle of the night, and most of us had come down by then. They talked some sense into us, and we went to bed. No one died or saw any guy in the woods ever again. I was traveling alone in southern France. One particular night, I decided to camp above a little beach in the outskirts of Nice. There were no flat spots, so I didn't pitch any tent, and I slept in my sleeping bag on a sloped patch of grass. I got a terrible night of sleep due to a beach cleaning truck, a group of teenagers that walked by, and my shitty choice of sleeping location. I woke up early in the morning to find that someone had taken my pack of cigarettes that was sitting inches from me as I slept, which is creepy as hell now that I think about it. The next day I decided to go snorkeling and stashed my backpack in a bush. I returned to find that someone had stolen half my clothes, my journal, my souvenirs, and all of my toiletries along with some of my electronics. I know, I'm a fucking idiot. This was pretty devastating, but the snorkeling was amazing. Later that evening, I was talking to a local fisherman on the beach, and I mentioned what happened. He said someone was probably watching me that morning, and saw me stash my stuff. None of this seemed too weird to me at the time, but looking back, it's really fucking creepy. After a recent trek through Nepal, I decided to fly to Dhaka, Bangladesh. Bangladesh Airlines was offering a sweet deal, and I had to leave Nepal anyway due to my expiring visa. So, on a whim, I bought the tickets and went there solo. Of course, the night before, my travel buddies and I decided to have one final night out. And of course, after a few too many beers, we ended up in some shady places with shady food and drink. Waking up the next morning, the day of my flight, I immediately knew something was off. I could feel it deep in my stomach. It wasn't the kind of food poisoning you throw up right after eating. I sat in the hostel, waiting for my taxi and waiting to vomit. I knew it was coming, the nausea almost completely overwhelming. I managed to keep it together until finally arriving at the airport. I started throwing up in the unair-conditioned waiting room next to a dude having the same problem but with the other end. I threw up 3 times before even boarding the plane. So I finally get on the plane and manage to hold it down until after takeoff, when the seatbelt sign finally switches off. Once it did, I threw off my seatbelt and half ran, half waddled to the back of the plane. Naturally, both were occupied. Being the incredible problem solver that I am, I snatched a vomit bag from one of the nearby seats and began the music of fucking misery. I'm halfway filling up this poor piece of paper when the entire bottom falls out. Like the entire bottom half of this bag became so disgusted with its content, it had to reject them completely. I now have vomit drenching my clothes. A plain white t-shirt was a poor choice. The flight attendants finally see the catastrophe taking place and start banging on the bathroom doors, where some poor soul emerges confused. After my business was finally done, and with my clothes now ruined, I shamefully slunk back to my seat. When I finally arrive in Dhaka, I walk up to the counter to get my visa on arrival. Even though I consider myself a pretty savvy traveler in terms of research, nothing I had read up to that point mentioned an exit flight requirement for a visa. So the officer asked for my exit flight information, and I'm doing my best to keep my shit together. Internally, I have no fucking clue what to do. Thankfully, the airport's free Wi-Fi was available, so I hopped online to book a random flight to get me through this gate. In my anxiety of this flight, the fact that I was sick was completely lost on me. I just forgot. So I'm sitting there at the counter, and I feel a deep rumble in my stomach. I'm thinking, yeah, this'll be a great fart, and let the baby blow. It wasn't a fart. I just shat my pants at a visa desk in fucking Bangladesh, with a customs officer looking me in the face. I can feel the slow, warm trickle moving down my legs. It was literal shame in physical form. Either understanding I was unwell, or perhaps smelling the situation, the visa officer mercifully provided me a visa. I spent the next week in Dhaka, Bangladesh, shitting and vomiting my brains out, and burnt that pair of underwear forever. I lost 10 pounds that week, eating Pringles and drinking water while watching the Airbender movie rerun over and over again. It's a fucking terrible movie, but it was on the only English channel available. This actually happened to me about a month ago. I'm a hunter. It's a great way for me to escape the everyday hustle and bustle and just sit alone in the woods, watching it either wake up or go to sleep. This particular day I was deer hunting about 20 feet up a tree, and anyone who hunts knows that you go all the way until dark, then you pack up your stuff, and then you come out. Sunset was around 5 p.m., and I sat in the tree until about 5:40 p.m. Then I climbed down the tree, packed up my stuff, and realized that I didn't have my flashlight. No big deal, I've got my cell phone. Oops, 5% battery left because I'm so far out in the woods, it was searching for signal the whole time and drained itself. I shut off my phone to conserve battery. I figure, oh well, I'll be fine. I'll start walking back now. Even though I spent a lot of time outdoors, and particularly spent every weekend as a kid in the woods, even I can get lost. There's a moment that I just can't describe where you realize that you're lost, and you have no flashlight, you have no idea which way to go. It's a pretty unsettling feeling, but you want to remain calm. You're panicking on the inside, but you know that will do no good to panic, so you try to calm yourself down. I did this for a while before I decided to just sit down. By this time, I had been lost in the woods, in the dark, with no flashlight for about 3 hours. It was an overcast night and a new moon, so I had zero light to work with. I decided to sit down and take inventory of what I had and remain calm. I took out my cell phone and sent my fiancée a text that said, "Phone dying, lost in the woods, may spend the night here. I promise I won't die. Love you." And I turned off my phone in case I needed that 3% to make an emergency call. It was now around 9 p.m. I realized that I wasn't going to die out there in the woods, but I wasn't going to have a fun night either. I did have a gun, plenty of ammo, clothing, and a bottle of water. Oh, and a full pack of cigarettes. I could start a fire and be fine. Wait, I could start a fire. I could build a torch. Why didn't I think of this before? I had some paracord that I had in my hunting pack that I typically use to pull my gun up a tree after I've decided to climb it. So I cut off a section of it and bundled up a few leaves, sticks, barks, and made a torch. It was wet, so I used some lip balm on the string to get it going a little better, and the torch worked. Not perfectly, but now I could see. I ended up eventually finding a trail that I knew, even in the dimly lit torch darkness, and hiked out from there to my vehicle. If it wasn't for that cigarette lighter, I'd probably have spent the night right there. I got to my truck, called my fiancée who was now freaking out, and headed home for a beer. When I was in high school, my grandmother taught me how to sew, and I made most of my clothes. This skill has remained a hobby throughout my life. In preparation for a tropical vacation, I made several bikinis. They were constructed with 3 plastic rings. One ring, placed in the center of the top, held the 2 bra sections together, and the other 2 rings connected the front of the bikini bottom to the back. The rings were placed on each hip. Using plastic rings to hold my itty-bitty bikini together turned out to be a very bad idea. After sunbathing for a while, I needed to cool off. I ran and dove into the clear turquoise ocean. After a nice refreshing swim, I stood up and began walking back to the shore. To my horror, the plastic rings holding my bikini together had melted in the hot sun, and they fell off while I was swimming. I can still see the bald man with the big belly dropping his cigar in the sand. Heading back into the ocean for cover, I waited for my beachmate to swim out with a cover-up. I felt hundreds of eyes staring at me as I walked back to the beach. This happened 40 years ago, and I feel like it was still yesterday. In 2016, I hiked from New Jersey to Virginia on the Appalachian Trail. I was on the part of the trail known as the roller coaster not far from Harper's Ferry. I hit heavy rain, and the trail became a stream, and all of my rain gear decided to give out. Everything I had was soaked. I had to spend the next day waiting for my gear to dry out at the nearest shelter. Around noon, I can see someone walking intersecting to the trail. I can tell he's not a hiker, being he had no bag and was wearing jeans. He told me his name was Steve. He was asking me if I knew a Chris or a Jim. Being that no one uses regular names on the trail, There would be no way to identify them even if they were real people. Steve said he had walked from DC about 80 miles and was told to meet Chris and Jim for further instructions. He said he had information, and the NSA was after him. I figured that the guy was having a mental break or something, and felt sorry that I couldn't help him. Not too far off was a free hiker hostel, maybe about a 4-hour walk. The hostel was just a shelter that was enclosed with a wood-burning stove, but next to it was a house that a ridge runner, someone who does trail maintenance, lived at. I directed him towards that. After all my stuff had dried, I headed to a hostel and got there early evening. As I'm walking up, I can see the ridge runner and Steve arguing. The ridge runner is yelling at Steve, telling him to take a trail to a road to leave this area. If he did not, the ridge runner would call the police for trespassing. At the shelter, I saw familiar people who filled me in on what had happened. At every shelter is a trail log. The log is a journal that keeps track of people who pass through and notes about what's happening on the trail. It's also a way to pass messages to people you might know behind you. Steve got a hold of the log and started looking for a message for him. He thought he had to decode the messages to find instructions for him. Steve started to write random things and crossing things out through the log. This action pissed off people who were already wary of Steve because of appearance of not looking like a fellow hiker. Steve also argued with a few people before this and made a fire to burn some paper he was carrying. They notified the ridge runner. People were pretty upset about Steve, so I never told them that I ran into him previously. I never saw Steve again and still think that he was a person with mental health issues having an episode. However, I do imagine the scenario where he was telling the truth and what his story was. Okay, most of you are going to call me an idiot on this one, and you're right. When I was 16 or 17, I threw a party at my house. Only a few people were supposed to come. So I got the great idea to drop 7 hits of acid. I later found out through the internet that this was an N-bomb, probably 25I. Upon coming up, I got super sick and felt like I had to puke, so I went to the bathroom, closed my eyes, and began to violently vomit. Only when I opened my eyes, there was nothing in the toilet, and I began to freak out, and the only thing I could say was, "What the fuck?" So I went back to my room to lay down and calm down while everybody else was throughout the house partying. I started to feel sick again when I was in my bed, and I felt like I had to puke again, but my brain was like, "Ha, you're not going to fool me this time, drugs," only to actually puke all over my floor. Now my tripping ass still couldn't grasp what happened, so I went to grab my best friend and pulled him into the room and asked him, "Dude, did I just throw up on my floor?" He looked down at it and said, "Oh god, yeah, you did, man." My dog then proceeded to come in and clean up my puke, which was disgusting. As the night progresses, a lot more people show up that I didn't know, and the party is getting way out of hand. People are outside screaming, drawing way too much attention alongside my driveway that is lined up with cars. Everybody is getting way too rowdy, so I decided to go downstairs and chill. This is where shit got even weirder. It seemed when I closed my eyes, I was spiraling deeper and deeper into my own head. I could feel it. People were actually coming down now at this point, trying to talk to me, but they all talked super slow motion-like, and their voice sounded like they were talking through a copper pipe. I looked at the deer mounts on the wall, and the buck was made up of complete Aztec tribal patterns with no fur at all. Then, in the midst of all of this, after people had left me alone to be down, I hear my back door kick open and my grandma start to scream, "Who the hell are you people?" And someone drunkenly responded, "Who are we? Who the hell are you?" My mental sanity snaps, and I start to panic and hide in a dark corner of my basement, waiting for her to come down. But the music kept on playing and people went on partying, so I was auditorily hallucinating the whole ordeal. At this point I realized I'm tripping way too hard and need to get everybody the fuck out before something bad happens. So I walk upstairs to find my buddy that helped me with the puke situation. I find him standing outside of the bathroom door closed. I knew immediately that something was off. I asked him if everything was okay and he said, "Yeah man, everything's cool, just go and chill." But I wasn't buying it. I opened the door to see a girl lying on the floor bleeding and crying bloody murder. My first thought was that she had gotten drunk and went to the bathroom, fell and cracked her head off something and was bleeding out. Her sister is in there blackout drunk with her, and she comes up to me and says, "Did you give her acid?" "I know you gave her acid, I'm going to call the cops." At this point I snap and don't know what to do. I'm pacing back and forth in my house. A little later, I found out that the sister that threatened to call the cops on me actually punched her younger sister in the face out of jealousy of another guy there that they were both going after. Along with this, I now have a naked, depressed girl walking up and down my street screaming and crying, and then went into the woods and nobody could find her for a good 4 hours. The party finally ended and nobody was hurt bad, but since this party I now hate alcohol. I saw from a different perspective what it does to people and how fucked up it makes you. Now, with that said, please anybody reading this, do not drop 7 hits of M-Bomb. After researching it a few weeks later, I should have been dead that night, and I don't know how I lucked out and survived. Several years ago, my brother was holding a party at an abandoned farm, and we'd obtained a big box full of mortar shell fireworks. These are egg-shaped and have a round burst charge on top of a launcher charge on one end of the shell. You light the fuse and drop the shell into a launch tube, and the launch charge shoots the shell into the air about 2 seconds before the burst charge explodes. We were up on the top of the hill shooting the shells into the air above the party on the side of the hill. We had fired off about half of the shells before someone accidentally dropped one of the shells upside down into the tube. The whole shell exploded all at once, blowing the tube apart and sending plastic and cardboard shrapnel in all directions. One piece of plastic hit the bridge of my nose right between my eyes. Half an inch either way and I would have lost an eye. Even worse, a flaming chunk landed in the box of shells, which immediately started going off. Everyone scattered to the din of over 100 shells exploding. In the darkness, I couldn't see where I was going and ended up running straight through a briar patch and some nettles. The entire box of shells had exploded in about 10 seconds, and we all made our way back to the top of the hill to the sound of the party wildly cheering the display. Miraculously, the puncture on my nose and my briar-scratched legs were the only injuries. When we went to clean up the hill the next day, we found pieces of the tube at the bottom of the hill nearly a quarter mile away. Two years ago, I was on an Arctic survival training in Nunavut, Canada, in February. No trees can grow there, nothing but rocks and snow. Shit's cold. Anyways, our group of about 150 people would move on snowmobiles to set up camp every night. We were guided by a group of Inuit rangers, real badasses. We moved in convoys, one behind another, always following the same tracks in case we got lost. The rule of thumb was if you couldn't see the guy behind you, you stop until the entire convoy stops and regroups. Well, one day, while on a run back from the new camp to pick up people and supplies, we hit a blizzard. We are on sea ice, and anywhere you look is flat, white, cold nothingness as far as the eye can see, which actually isn't very far with all the wind and snow, maybe about 20 meters. We were trying to get back as fast as possible. Too fast, apparently. I look back and can't see anyone behind me, so I stop and look in front of me to see a blur silhouette and dim tailgate light disappear in this white hell. I look back again. Nothing. I'm alone. Of course I don't panic. The system worked all the time, so I wait. But after a couple of minutes, I get anxious. What if the guy behind me passed in the blizzard and found the convoy? Our faces are completely covered and we were wearing the same gear. There's no way of identifying each other. They wouldn't know I was missing until they reached camp. Or what if the convoy turned back and found them, but not me? Or what if everyone behind me is just waiting on the next one as planned? So I sit on my right and wait, until I think there's no way they haven't caught up yet. Fuck this, I'm going to find the convoy and see what's up. So I start moving and look down at the snow. There's no tracks. Fuck. The wind had swept them away. How? It's been like 10 minutes tops. I'm screwed. I start moving in the direction I think is right, when suddenly I see someone coming. It's a goddamn ranger. A northern badass wearing a fucking hoodie, and his rifle on his back and a cigarette in his leathery lips, all in a blizzard. He leads me back to the convoy, the entire convoy. It turns out that the group behind me did pass right by me, and we didn't notice. We kept going like nothing had happened. And that was the most terrifying experience of my life. Many years ago, when I was young and single, two buddies of mine and I took a ski boat out to a local area lake that was quite popular with the 20-something crowd. We picked an area in front of a popular beach to begin our skiing. Our buddy Larry volunteered to be the first to ski as he spotted 3 single females sunning on that nearby beach. He had a plan. He told us to pull him towards that area of the beach and then make a sharp left turn. He was going to let loose of the ski ropes and then ski onto the beach, hoping to impress those girls and start a conversation. All was going as planned, except the boat was going a bit too fast, and the sharp left turn served to propel Larry towards the beach much faster than planned. He hit the sand going way too fast. His upper body was leaning forward while his legs came out of the skis. His legs and flailing arms made him look like a big seabird taking off from the water, and then he slammed face first into the sand right in front of the girls. He got up, brushed himself off, walked back to the skis, and waited for us to pick him up as the sound of 3 hysterically laughing young ladies followed him. Yep, he certainly made an impression all right, on the girls and in the sand. One year, me and some of my friends decided to invent a game called American Roulette. We sat in a tight circle around the campfire, each of us with a handful of bottle rockets. We went around the circle, each throwing a rocket into the fire pit, one at a time. Rules were if you moved out of the way or got hit with a rocket, you were out. Well, we ran out of rockets without having a winner, so a buddy of mine who had some fast fuse and a box of Strike Anywhere matches decided he was going to make a homemade rocket. Needless to say, it didn't work out as planned. When he lit the fast fuse, he couldn't throw it fast enough and it blew up in his hand. He had 3rd-degree burns on both hands and needed to be taken 2 hours away to the nearest hospital with a burn ward. Despite this, I don't think any one of us, including him, would have taken it back, and he definitely wouldn't want to be used as the poster child to take fireworks away from people. His actions, his responsibility, his consequences, and he understands this. We still play American Roulette on occasion. Traveling in South America by myself as a 22-year-old woman. I arrived in Santiago, Chile by bus really late at night, like around 10 p.m. Shortly after I got off the bus, a guy comes up to me from the general area of the taxi stand and asks if I need a cab ride. I say yes. We start walking to his cab and it's really far away, like at least 5 blocks. I start to feel kind of uneasy, but I'm also in the middle of this big, unfamiliar city and just try to reassure myself that it's fine. I double check that his cab has all the normal brand markings when we finally get to it, and sit up front with my bag. That was more out of habit, as it's common to do this in Ubers in South America. I give him the address of the hostel I booked, and we small talk in Spanish for a few minutes of the ride. And then there's a bit of an unnatural pause, which he breaks by looking over at me and saying very calmly, "Are you scared?" Of course that really freaked me out, but I just tried to stay calm. I just laugh a bit and say, no, I'm good. Just tired and it's late. And he goes, well, you seemed pretty scared back there when we were walking. You know, there's a lot of bad people around here. Sometimes they pretend to be taxis. You never know who to trust. I've heard of women being sold after taking a bad taxi. Are you traveling here alone? He said that all while we were still driving through the middle of the city. It's dark and it's late, and now I'm painfully aware literally no one knows where I am. I was going to message my family with an update when I got to the hostel. They don't know I'm in Santiago. They think I'm still on the coast. Of course I don't say that and tell them that I'm always very careful and actually my group of friends know I'm on the way and are waiting for me at the hostel. I see a stoplight coming up and was literally thinking that as soon as the car slowed down, I was going to make a break for it and just jump out of the car. Probably the most scared I've ever been in my life. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I see this guy reaching down for something under his seat, and my brain just goes, gun, 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 it's going to be a gun. Instead, he pulls out a pamphlet, and then he goes, but you know, there's always one thing we can trust, right? The Lord. Do you believe in God? And then proceeded to try and convert me for the remainder of the ride. It turned out to be harmless, but in the moment, that random religious cab driver scared the absolute shit out of me. Once upon a time, a couple friends and I did acid in my apartment. At the time, I had a disassembled television on my living room floor that was being converted into an aquarium. This made it be so that there was also a lot of tools lying on the floor. I thought about how I should pull all of this away before we dropped, but I didn't. More on that later. Starting the trip out at my friend's house was fun, but as he was not practicing, it was a bit strange, so we decided to go back to my apartment. I tried to open my front door, but the acid was kicking in and I forgot briefly how keys worked. I panicked and ran to my friend's house. I explained my situation to a girl I barely knew. I gave her my keys and phone number, and she said that she would call me when she got into my apartment. Eventually she got in and I got the call. I went home, and I swear I was in the apartment for at least an hour before I realized that nearly every object I owned was turned upside down. Things settled down and the trip was going well. A friend of mine is sitting in the middle of my living room floor, cross-legged. He hasn't spoken for a while, but I was tripping out and didn't realize. What happened next seemed to come at me in slow motion. I see him one moment sitting in silence with his eyes closed, and the next moment he has a hammer in his hand and is screaming. He is now swinging the hammer overhead, not only at my dismantled television, but also my working television. Boom. Both televisions smashed, and my buddy and I are screaming in terror. Now, if you've ever had the pleasure of smashing a CRT, you know that a plume of phosphorus flakes fill the air. There were now 2 large televisions worth of phosphorus flakes in the air, and we're all freaking out at my friend. After what seemed like forever, we calmed him down and decided it was best to return to my friend's house and deal with the mess later. We convinced Crazy Friend to put his shoes on and prepare to leave. He doesn't quite realize what he has done yet. We open the door to leave, and he fucking ninja dives headfirst down the staircase. Boom, he's gone. I'm now running around the neighborhood, tripping my balls off and looking for my friend who's even worse off than me. We call other friends who are also looking for him. We split up, and about 30 minutes later, I alone find him. It's night at this point, and I see my friend as a shadowy figure in the distance on the other side of the street. He's wearing no shirt, his pants are ripped to shreds, and he has several dozen deep cuts across his body and is bleeding profusely. I approach him, but he's so far gone that he doesn't recognize me. Not wanting to startle him, I approach slowly. I try to reassure him and direct him to our friend's house. "It's me, man. Let's go relax, okay?" He only grunts. He's that far gone. I get him to our friend's house and we give him some crayons to color and he writes out the trip. Now the kicker. It turns out when he dove from my apartment, he ran into one of my neighbor's yards and dove through a bunch of rose bushes, tearing his clothes and cutting him up. He then went into someone's back door thinking he was home. The homeowner found a crazy bleeding man in his kitchen but remained calm. My friend then takes off all of his clothes in this stranger's house as an offering because he thinks he's been judged by Satan. He hands the stranger his shirt and wallet and pants. The stranger gives my friend his pants back and gets him to leave, and that's when I found him. The next morning, my friend realizes what he's done and goes to apologize to the stranger. They're now Facebook friends. Not creepy in the sense that I was scared, but creepy in the sense that I wanted this motherfucker to get away from me. I was taking a red-eye from Miami to Buenos Aires. It's a pretty long flight. Like an idiot, I thought that a middle seat at the front of the plane would be more desirable than a window or aisle seat at the back of the plane. It wasn't. So there I was, in the middle seat of the plane with older gentlemen on both sides of me. The unspoken rules of the airplane are as follows. The aisle seat can extend their leg into the aisle, the window seat can lean against the side of the plane, and the middle seat gets both armrests. Those are the rules. I've been traveling for work for a long time, and those are just the rules. The guy in the window seat must not have known the rules because he kept trying to push my arm off his armrest. I fought him for a little while, but eventually let him have the armrest and just tried to get some sleep. Things neither escalated nor de-escalated until about 30 minutes after we had taken off. A foul stench reached my nose, and I couldn't immediately identify its source. I briefly inspected my surroundings and discovered that my window seat neighbor had removed his shoes. Exposed and naked to the world, his greasy toes wiggled and shamelessly exuded an aroma that was a mix of sulfur, sausage gravy, and mold. To my absolute shock, he lifted his foot nearest me, slid it out from the space under the seat in front of him, and placed it in the adjacent space under the seat in front of me, the space my feet were actively occupying. In the following moments, I realized I had a decision to make as to the severity of the conflict I would instigate. I had immediately decided that conflict would be unavoidable, with the brashness of my rude neighbor's most recent offense. There was a scale of following actions that I could have taken. I could have nudged his leg and treated the scenario like an honest mistake, which it was not. I could have gone straight to yelling, which would have been most uncomfortable in the early stages of a red-eye flight. I opted for a multi-step approach. First, I, quote, accidentally stepped on his toes with my heel. He responded to this by pulling his leg up, clearly looking to readjust and place it back near where it was. I caught his knee as he pulled his leg up and firmly guided it back to the space he was allotted. No eye contact was made, but he grunted in displeasure of my actions. In anticipation of a retort, I remained ready to defend what little territory this American Airlines flight had loaned me for the evening. As in most scenarios regarding any scale of conflict, my heart beat quickly and my adrenaline surged for triple, maybe even quadruple, the amount of time the situation actually took place. After the incident, he appeared to abandon his invasion and spent the remainder of the flight impersonating a hibernating grizzly bear with sleep apnea. Between the adrenaline that remained in my system and his unnaturally loud, throaty snores, very little sleep was had. Fuck that guy. When I was about 6, I went for a walk along the beach with my mom and sister, who was only 1 year old at the time. My mom was pushing my sister in her buggy, and I was cavorting and gathering shells. All was good. We were near a lighthouse which had a sunken tidal path to it, and long story short, my mom had misread the tide times that morning and hadn't read the sign at the top of the path. About halfway through our walk back from the lighthouse, the sea suddenly seemed way closer than it should be. I see nothing wrong with this being 6, but my mom immediately and justifiably freaks out. She rushes along the path with the buggy, yelling for me to keep up, but I got distracted trying to gather my bucket of shells. Now, I don't remember exactly how it happened, but I ended up on my own at the bottom of a really steep slope, with the water literally at my heels and my mom shouting and crying from the top of it for me to run up. I was terrified and absolutely frozen. And I remember distinctly just thinking that I was gonna die. It was getting dim, nobody was around, and my mom later told me she was desperately just trying to find some way to get back down the slope to get me without putting my baby sister in danger as well. I eventually snapped out of it and climbed the slope really slowly, using these smooth metal things that were laid into the path as handholds. By the time I got to the top of the path, the rest was completely covered by water. I was fine, but shaken. And my mom never took us back down that path again without triple checking the tide times first. Gave me a lasting, healthy respect for the ocean, mind you. Tides can come in quicker than you'd ever expect. Don't play around with that shit. We went backpacking in the San Gabriel Wilderness in California for a few days when a fire started. This was around 2002 or 2003. We got cut off from our exit and got stranded. We were trying to follow a fork of the San Gabriel River, but the fire was charging down the ravine and cut us off. We were about 10 miles in and had to figure out how to circumnavigate the fire. It was really fucking scary. It was really windy, smoky, and overall, again, scary. Giant towers of smoke were just piling up in the air. Search and rescue was buzzing the area along with fire planes dumping water and chemicals. Finally, we got to the top of the ridge to see where we could go from there. At this point, water was getting short, as we were anticipating being able to use the river water. We see that we can get over the next ridge and cut back down to the river, so we set the compass and move out. We got back down to the river and filled up on water. We were fucking exhausted and miserable. Our lungs hurt, our legs hurt, and we had been out since the early AM. We were all tired, and the detour took us another 3 to 4 miles out of the way and added another 3,000 to 4,000 feet of elevation gain. And ticks. Motherfucking ticks. So we finally get back to the river, fill up on water again, and we can't stop. The fire is on our backs at this point, and we think it's advancing towards us. We have about 8 more miles to go at this point, and we all seriously consider dropping our gear, grabbing the water filter and bottles, and just book it down the riverbed. We decided not to do that and just tough it out, which I'm so glad we did. After about another hour of making it down the river, we run into the search and rescue squad. We're all just blown away. I couldn't believe that this was even happening. It was just surreal. We weren't lost anymore once we got back down to the river, but now we had help and encouragement. The search and rescue team was also equally surprised, looking at us covered in dirt and ash, wheezing, and just plain beat. They told us that we had to get moving as the fire was running along the ridge parallel to the river and was coming down the ravine. We booked it the fuck out of there and got in our cars, which we then had to drive what normally would have been a 2-hour drive, but it turned into a 5-hour ordeal due to conditions and traffic. The only way that the search and rescue team even knew that we were back there was because of our cars and a note that I had left in the dash. How many people, how long we were going to be gone, and where we were heading to. We were all so tired. Months later, I went back to an area we had passed through on our hike after the fire. It was completely scorched. We would have been some crispy critters if we slacked and rested. In 2004, my friend and I drove to Pennsylvania to load up on about $300 worth of fireworks. We didn't know much about them, but bought the heavier things available, including some mortar shells and the tube to shoot them out of. We went to my friend's lake house for our usual 4th BBQ and had been drinking all day. Before we knew it, the sun was down and it was go time. We grabbed a mortar, shoved it into the tube, and lit the fuse, but nothing happened. What we didn't realize was the tube was preloaded, and another mortar was jammed in there now. My friend grabbed the tube to investigate, and as soon as he picked it up, both mortars exploded and shot out into the box of fireworks. We had about a 10-second window to panic, but we didn't even think to do that. The entire box was on fire, and the ensuing explosions were like World War III shooting past everyone's heads, pelting the houses and nearly setting the trees on fire. We ducked under cars and the dogs jumped into the lake. My friend's face and chest were bloody and soot-covered, and his hand was burned and numb, but there wasn't any permanent damage. The next-door neighbor did throw a punch at him, though, and called the sheriff. I highly recommend setting a box of fireworks on fire all at once. It's my first summer on a busy beach, and I'm sitting by our pier doing my best to look like a competent lifeguard. It's a crowded tower full of surfers, a few fishermen, and families. The waves were good, which sometimes causes issues between surfers and bathers, but it's low tide and there are several slows with a few feet of water in them acting as kiddie pools, so everything was mellow. Or so I thought. I hear a commotion at one of the slows where several children are playing, and I turn to look. A group of adults have surrounded a fisherman, and whatever is going on is escalating quickly. Several people motion for me to come over. I grab my 2-way radio, buoy, and go. Sharks. That's what the fisherman had been catching. The kiddie pool. That's where he had been releasing them. Really drunk. That's what he was, and he thought it was hilarious. They were little tiny sharks, so it kind of was hilarious, but now it was my problem, so no, it wasn't hilarious. Luckily, someone had already called the cops, and they were nearby. I kept an eye on the water and an ear on the conversation as the parents ripped this guy a new one, and the cop made him borrow a net and pull out all the baby sharks back in the ocean. I've never seen or heard anything like that since. My first time tripping on 2CB, me and 2 friends found a nice little outside cafe in a park where colored lights were strung up all over the tables. It had closed and there was no sign of people, so we decided to sit down and enjoy the pretty lights as we started tripping. Suddenly, we hear some commotion coming from behind the cafe, and a man bursts out laughing. Seconds later, he comes around the corner, seemingly in tears from laughing. He parted with whoever he was with and caught sight of us. He points to my friend and calls out the completely wrong name. My friend, who was 17 at the time, corrects the obviously drunk man that looks to be in his 30s. It turns out that they had met several times before. I was later informed that the man is known as the local friendly alcoholic who may or may not be homeless. The man is still out of breath from laughing and tells us, the funniest thing just happened. But before he told us what was funny, he got a bit sidetracked. He introduced himself to me and my other friend who was completely uninterested in the situation. After introductions, he completely derailed the conversation, and I started tripping harder by now. I was intrigued by what this somewhat crazy, friendly, talkative alcoholic would have to say. A lot of what he said just seemed like filler now, but when finding out we were tripping, he gave us thoughts on what psychedelic combos are the best. We talked weed and wine, he talked about his love for CBD oils and how they work. Despite us saying we know how they work, he kept explaining. Then we got to talking about alcohol, and when I mentioned the dangers of alcohol, I got an hour-long history lesson on how they distilled wine in 1850 France and how they do it differently nowadays. How wine was good for you, and how fat made you not drunk, or something like that. He rambled on like this for hours, often repeating things that he had already said, due to my friend arguing for no reason. But since we were on 2CB, we thought this would all loop back and he would finally explain the incredibly funny thing that had occurred. The man said goodbye, called us all the wrong names, and left abruptly after checking the time. I turned towards my friend and realized the 2CB was wearing off. Upon checking the time, we calculate he talked for about 4.5 hours. We spent our entire trip talking to the local drunk. 4.5 hours of non-stop talking for what? Some arguments that got nowhere, information we already knew, and a whole trip gone. We thought the drunk rambling would lead somewhere, loop back and answer our burning questions. What was so funny? At the time, we were sort of mad that the trip was wasted, but now we look back and laugh at how we just sat there listening to him talk for so long, while tripping hard just waiting to hear what was so funny, and then we ended up getting lost in endless chatter and not noticing the hours just ticking by. I was an exchange student in China around 2000, and with a fellow buddy I was exploring Xi'an. Our hotel was on a very big 6 lanes brightly lit street with half the people foreigners. At about 10 p.m. me and my mate decided to go out and find something to eat. At an intersection we found a smallish shop, bought a snack and asked around with super limited Chinese and English, and found someone who spoke English, the quote niece of the shop owner. She was super young, but spoke good English and said that she could direct us to a very good and cheap restaurant. So we agreed, and she leads us just down the street and into the non-tourist part of the city. It was interesting how the surroundings changed. After a few minutes, we were the only foreigners on the street, and a lot of people were staring at us. The buildings became more run down, and the place wasn't very brightly lit, but it was still charming. She kept talking to us, asking us questions, where we stayed, how long we stayed, what our plans were, etc. She also mentions a few times that she was studying and 21 years of age. This raised a few alarms with me, but me and my mate didn't want to be rude, and we were really hungry. After about 15 minutes, we arrived at a very small and somewhat charming restaurant. I don't know the proper name for this kind of shop, but in China, at least the cities that I visited, there were a lot of shops in prefabricated houses. Each house had 2 smaller shops on the street level, and you could see all sorts of businesses in these, some of the bigger ones renting 2 adjoining ones to form a bigger shop, etc. The restaurant was in one such half-size store. There was just 4 tables, 1 counter to the kitchen, and in the back there was 1 video game machine. With the help of our translator, we ordered and then she excused herself. The food was really good and cheap. We both got a super large bowl of ramen, a heaping dish of different baozi dumplings, and several beverages for no more than 25 to 30 bucks. So far so good, but what really made the situation strange was several other factors. For one, the other guests in the restaurants looked like straight out of a crime flick, and they were talking about us, pointing and laughing. One had a bad knife scar on his cheek, the other one a broken nose, and a third one, I kid you not, an eye patch. While we ate, we saw a lot of people gawking at us, but especially noticed something like gangsters. There were 4 youngsters with matching leather jackets and short-cropped hair who patrolled the street at least 4 times while we stayed there and always looked straight at us while they passed the shop. After we ate and paid, all of a sudden our 21-year-old translator turned up again, inquired if the food was good, and offered to take us to some very good place with a lot of fun. We declined and thanked her, but said that we would just return as we were tired. She fast-talked us and told us about a party, beautiful women, young girls, etc. But when we saw the younger gangsters again, we waited 1 minute and then just bailed out of there. She followed us and seemed very frustrated and even panicky that we left so suddenly. She tried her best to convince us to follow her offer, but we got out of there ASAP. In high-speed mode, we made it back to that big 6-laned main road and said goodbye to her. That whole situation was actually super scary. In hindsight, they were probably all just very nice, hardworking people who had just never seen foreigners in this part of the city. But those youngster gangers, those cliché pirates at the other table, and the shady way how that girl tried to goad us into God knows where, multiple times stating that she was 21 years of age, all of this together just led me to the conclusion that we got out of there just in time. Anaheim Lake, British Columbia, 1967. I had only arrived that day. My friends, Mike and his wife, had gone to town for groceries and left me at a cabin with the dog. I decided to go for a walk. Tybalt, the dog, and I took off across the road and into the woods. After strolling around for a while, I crossed back over the road and continued on. I climbed up some ridges and wandered down into the little hollows, not paying much attention to where I was. I had never been in big woods before, not so far north anyway. I began to tire and think about food, so I decided to head back to the cabin. I then realized in one heart-stopping moment that I had no idea where I was. I could feel the panic building way down inside me, ready to reduce me to a pissing, screaming imbecile. I scrambled up a ridge and then a tree at the top of it to look out. I saw an ocean of jack pines, dark foreboding trees in all directions. Nothing relieved the monotony of those trees. Nothing. No one knew where I was. I remembered a map I had, back in the truck of course, which showed that the cabin was 7 miles from the nearest house to the east, 90 miles to the west, 400 miles to the north, and the same to the south. I was fighting off panic with every breath and on the edge of losing the battle. I was lost, and I knew, in my churning guts, I knew I could die right there. Tybalt seemed unconcerned, though. Stupid dog. I sat still, again on the ground, afraid. I had no thoughts. I was paralyzed, unable to move. Somehow, I found, somewhere inside of me, underneath the roaring terror, a place that was dead calm. I had no idea it was there, but I found it. I looked out from that place within and saw clearly everything around me. After a long moment, I felt a tug, right in my middle, strong and clear. Without a thought, I got up and followed that steady pull. I walked straight back to the cabin as if I were on a well-marked path. I didn't tell this story for years, and quite frankly, I still don't understand it. Most of my family lives in Idaho, with my grandmother's house being on a golf course. My uncle decided that this was the perfect spot to set off some fireworks for the 4th of July. He also had a terrible Jack Russell named Casper, who was a poorly trained shithead. My uncle and his kids aren't much on dog ownership and didn't really bother to train the dog any. They had a pretty standard fireworks set, nothing too impressive, just Roman candles, bottle rockets, and some other basics. Casper, who lives through this story by the way, was off the leash running around doing the things a shithead dog does. Then they lit a Roman candle. At this point, Casper decides that it's a toy and grabs the thing and runs off. So now we have a dog running around with a lit Roman candle spewing balls of fire. No one can catch the dog, and finally the Roman candle goes out, but the dog refuses to come back. So my uncle decides to fight fire with fire, and lights another Roman candle hoping to entice the dog back. It actually works, but there was no strategy to stop the dog once he got the Roman candle. So he swooped in, grabbed the second Roman candle, and took off again. By this time, most of the family was laughing too hard to actually chase the dog. He managed not to catch anything on fire and eventually returned unscathed. Fortunately, my uncle gave up on firing off any more Roman candles. When I was 12, I was at the beach with my family friends. We were messing around and our parents told us to come in. As the kids filtered out of the water, I lingered. The water was drawing back farther and farther, and I scooted closer to the lapping waves, diving into them and laughing my head off when I emerged. There was, however, one problem. I was behind the waves. This, at the time, didn't seem like a problem, and I decided that it was finally time to head out of the water. I tried to paddle out, but couldn't seem to get in front of the waves. Panic began to settle like a weight on my chest as realization dawned upon me. I was stuck in the riptide. Now, keep in mind, when you're in a riptide, there are a few things that you have to do. First, calm the fuck down. Second, wave your hands to get the lifeguard's attention. Third, stay calm. If you're panicking, your likelihood of drowning is raised considerably. Of course, I panicked and started shrieking to try and get my mom's attention. Naturally, she couldn't hear me. I was drifting further and further out. Thank God I was a good swimmer for my age. Not to mention the adrenaline that flooded my senses was enough to keep me going until a group of older boys saw me panicking and swam into the riptide to help me. They had a boogie board that I held onto as they caught the attention of the lifeguard. Nobody ended up getting hurt, and I was gently instructed on what to do when I get stuck in a riptide. The lifeguard and I slowly made our way back to shore. This was all good, however, I was still a bit embarrassed because it is pretty obvious that you really just aren't supposed to panic and scream. If it hadn't been for the group of boys that got the lifeguard's attention, I don't really know what I would have done. This may or may not get buried. My mom used to get a prescription for 10 milligrams of Ambien every month. She never took them because she didn't like the way they made her feel in the morning. She gave me half of one once when I hadn't slept in 3 days, and thus began my journey into an Ambien dimension. The best story I have is one night when I was about 15, my friend came over and we each took 2. I was in the bathroom when it kicked in, and I went back out into the hallway. I looked down and the design of the carpet turned into mecha dinosaurs, Indians and Vikings riding mammoths, all in a full-on war with each other. And if I moved my hand over the carpet, they would all go back to their sides and then start again. I watched them battle until they all faded away, and then went back into my room with my friend. She was watching some TV and asked if we could smoke. I said sure and packed one up. We sat on the end of the bed across from each other, and we only had one lighter, so commence us smoking. The Ambien is hitting hard at this point, and I'm having a hard time with depth perception. I take the bowl from her, and she just goes into full-on zone mode, staring at the TV. I start looking around the bed for the lighter, and just as I see it, a hand wraps around it, and it's lightly lifted at my face as if it's being handed to me. I look up, and there's a guy sitting right behind my friend on the bed in a suit and a top hat with a monocle. I swear to fuck, I looked this son of a bitch in the eye as I took the lighter from him and continued to do so as I lit the bowl. After I lit it, he just sort of faded away. But man, I swear I took the lighter from him. My friend was gone in La La Land, and I could see her staring at the TV out of my peripheral vision as this all happened. I hadn't had any major incidents while traveling, but it finally caught up with me this April. My husband and I were in Cape Town and went to Our Bay to do a snorkeling with seals thing. It wrapped up by midday, so we decided to go check out a farmer's market that was only a 10-minute walk away. It was a pretty touristy area, broad daylight around noon, and a short walk. It seemed like no big deal. We started walking towards the market and approached the start of an S-curve in the road. We see people walking past us in the opposite direction and cars driving by. We get to the middle of the S-curve, so the area we came from is now hidden from us, as is the area we are heading to. It was a blind spot, so to speak. All of a sudden, we just noticed these 2 guys walk past us, again. They had passed us just a couple minutes earlier, going the other way. We remembered them since one of the guys had a bright orange shirt on. Next thing I know, this orange shirt guy is walking towards me with a wooden pole raised threateningly. He doesn't say a word and starts hitting me. There's literally no one else around at this point, nor any cars driving by. The next few minutes are a blur. I just remember yelling no and screaming for help and somehow ending up on the ground trying to kick this guy away. After what feels like forever, a community patrol drives around the corner. He's basically a local neighborhood watch guy. He sees what's happening and pulls up and gets out of the car, which causes the 2 guys to bolt. We end up being taken to a fire department by our savior, who then patch us up a little bit before getting taken to the police by an ambulance to file a report. My husband had to get some stitches on his elbow from blocking some blows, and we both had a ton of bruises, but luckily no broken bones or anything else major. It still feels so surreal now. It's a I can't believe that actually happened to me kind of moment. We thought we're always aware of our surroundings, but we let our guards down that day and got really unlucky that no one else was walking when we were. It just taught us that these things can happen to anyone at any time, not just when it's dark out. Always be aware of your surroundings, especially in a place that has a reputation for violent crime. About 3 years ago, I struggled severely with depression and suicidal thoughts. Those thoughts later manifested into plots. I'd stay up at night thinking about how I want to go out of this world. I thought about pills, slitting my wrists, all the cliche stuff you see in movies. I eventually decided upon a slow bleed method. I constructed a plan to make a 2-hour drive from my house to the Inyo National Forest after work on a Friday and get lost. The plan was simple and stupid. I'd try to survive as long as possible until something killed me, be it dehydration, fatigue, or whatever else nature had to throw in my way. I ordered some survival essentials on Amazon, packed a bag, and left as planned. I don't know what made this slow bleed idea so seductive, but my mind was set on it. I had no idea where I was going, but the drive felt like I was 10 again and on my way to Disneyland with my parents for the first time. I felt so overjoyed and relieved. I got there, parked my car behind some bushes, and started walking. It was about 5 p.m. and the sun was falling quick, bad planning on my part. So I started running, deeper and deeper into the forest. I would run, then tire so I'd walk a little, then run again, and I repeated this process for about 3 hours. I stopped at a clearing in the trees. It was a round little patch of mostly dead grass and leaves. I pitched my tent, unrolled my sleeping bag, and fell asleep happy as can be. The next morning was far less tranquil, however. I woke up feeling like I had a terrible hangover, and I had no idea where I was or how I'd gotten there for at least 5 minutes. I began breathing rapidly and started jogging in random directions, trying to retrace my steps. I ended up getting even more lost and separating myself from my gear and tent. I tried telling myself that this was what I wanted, but for some reason I knew it wasn't anymore. I remember repeating, "no choice," over and over again. That was a really cold night. I tried doing some push-ups to keep me warm, but that hardly lasted. I tried singing Vienna by Billy Joel, but I was too cold and my teeth kept chattering. Although the cold was nothing compared to the fear. Every falling leaf or trickling sound of a stream was a vicious predator in my mind. There was a point where I couldn't tell whether I was shaking from fear, the cold, or a mixture of both. Finally, the morning came and I slept through most of the day on the ground with my back to a fallen tree stump. I woke around 3 p.m. and once again I panicked. I began jogging in seemingly random directions once again until I hit the road I came on. That feeling of relief was something I will never be able to explain. It humbled me, yet filled me up. I walked up the road until a very nice old man in a big black truck pulled over to see if I needed any help. I told him I was hiking and got lost. He drove me up the road to my car and I drove home. That weekend changed everything for me. I never had suicidal thoughts again, and I got the help I needed to deal with my depression. This isn't much of a survival story, but the whole experience changed my point of view on life and self-worth. I'm still working on constructing a suitable life for myself, but whenever I'm discouraged or I want to quit, I think back to that night in the forest, and after a quick shudder, I realize just how much my life means to me. It was a stupid plan, but I'm glad it was. I may not have survived a slightly more elaborate one. Here's a little bit of background. I own and operate my own retail store. It's actually a seasonal fireworks tent, but not like any fireworks tent you've ever seen before. It's 2,400 square feet of fireworks heaven, where the party and the insanity climax at midnight on the 4th of July and New Year's Eve. Saying that we get a lot of interesting characters at the fireworks tent is an understatement of epic proportions. It's the equivalent of saying, quote, Miley Cyrus has changed since appearing on Hannah Montana. One of our regulars is affectionately known as Batman. The first time I met him, he arrived at the tent riding a bicycle. I should mention he was about 19 then, and looking for a very specific type of firework. He wanted something small, less than half an inch in diameter, that would shoot flaming balls or some other object, preferably one that exploded on impact. It also had to be less than 7.5 inches long. In retrospect, I probably should have been more curious or concerned about his requirements. In all honesty, I get so many strange questions and requests, I don't think his went above a 4 on my weird shit meter. I spent some time walking around with him and showing him different fireworks that might fit his needs. I suggested possibly a Roman candle trimmed down in length, since most of the tube is just empty space anyway. He browsed for a while, and then left without buying anything. A few hours later, though, he pedaled up to my tent again and asked if there was some place private that we could talk. I was busy, but now I was definitely more than a little curious. I led him outside of the tent and into my on-site storage container. Reaching into his backpack, he pulled out a set of black Batman forearm guards, but completely made out of metal. There was a metal cylinder that ran the length of the guard to support the blades. He had pulled the end off of the cylinder and wanted to shove the fireworks in a hole so that they could shoot out. At that point, I stupidly asked him what these were for, and he looked me dead in the eyes and told me that he couldn't say. Yeah, it's like that one perfect moment where everything slows down and everything inexplicably comes together to create a magical point in time. It's like hitting the home run in the bottom of the 9th inning to come from behind and win the big game. It's like looking up and seeing the lottery numbers you picked displayed on screen after the drawing. I was about to supply batshit crazy Batman with his weapons. I spent the next hour personally modifying Roman candles so that they would fit in the cylinder. I provided him with a generous supply, no charge of course. How can you charge Batman for his weapons? He solemnly thanked me, climbed onto his bicycle, and pedaled off into the sunset. I anxiously watched the news every night for weeks, waiting for the tales of his exploits. Alas, they never appeared, obviously covered up by the corrupt media in partnership with the underworld bosses. I see him every year, back at the tent, and browsing for fireworks. When our eyes lock, we exchange a knowing nod, and I will always inquire as to whether he needs any more quote-unquote supplies. He has not. Obviously, he's now importing them from China in mass quantities under a fictitious company name, so as to avoid suspicion. And so it begins.